A homemade bomb ripped through a rural home, and investigators had no idea who was responsible. The device was made with common items found in any store, but a tiny battery number and the label inside a computer uncovered a bizarre tale of the tiny town of Fairhaven, Vermont, is about as far removed from big city life as any place in the country. Violence was virtually unheard of, but even so, locals used to joke that Sheila Rockwell and her 17-year-old son, Chris Marquis, lived in the safest place in town, about 100 feet away from the police station. But all of that changed one March afternoon in 1998.
And he had handed me a package.
Hi, I'm package for delivery.
And I looked at the package, and the package had said, Samantha Brown on it. Well, it didn't ring a bell to me because I don't know who any Samantha Brown was. So I brought it in to Chris.
Got a package here.
Chris was sitting at his desk in his bedroom, and he didn't know a Samantha Brown either. He opened the box. Inside was a smaller box wrapped with string. He cut the string, and there was an explosion.
And I did realize that I was hit because my fingers were gone. I tried crawling to Chris because he was moaning. And that's when I realized that my knee wasn't there and that I couldn't get to him.
Chief Ray Vigor heard the explosion and ran over to investigate.
Walked down this little corridor into the living room, and then we could see some stuff coming out of the hallway there, and young Chris was laying on right there in the hallway, half in the room, half out.
Both Sheila and Chris were rushed to the hospital.
A large piece of the shrapnel in this case went towards Christopher Marquis' leg and essentially blew a large hole in his thigh and severed his femoral artery, and he bled to death.
I kept asking, where is Chris? Where is Chris? How is Chris doing? And Dr. Hartman came in, and he put his hand on mine, and he said, Sheila, Chris didn't make it. And I can remember just letting out a scream, and then they had, put me under.
The shrapnel found at the bomb scene indicated it was a pipe bomb, the favorite device of amateur bombers. Tiny brass hex nuts had been wrapped around the bomb to make it even more deadly.
It's a terrible circumstance of violent crime that somebody just hooks up with the wrong person at the wrong time and becomes the victim of this kind of outrageous activity.
The return address on the package said, Samantha Brown, from Bucyrus, Ohio. When police checked the name and address, they found both were fictitious. Chris Marquis was a 17-year-old high school dropout, a loner. Because of an eye condition, he was slowly going blind. He spent most of his time indoors, and he had few friends. Yet someone clearly wanted to kill him. But who? As police looked into his background, they found Chris had a secret life, something his family knew nothing about. As police combed through the wreckage of Chris Marquis' bedroom, they had one question: who wanted him dead? The package was shipped from Ohio and was addressed to the CB Shack in care of Chris Marquis. It was a small business Chris ran out of his home, selling citizen band radios and parts through the internet.
Well, it wasn't really a business. It was mainly local people. Friends of his that he would fix their radio, or people would hear him on the radio, probably bragging and telling him how he could fix radios, And it was pretty much locals.
But investigators soon discovered that Chris Marquis didn't always treat his customers fairly.
I think it's fair to say that Christopher Marquis was not completely honest in all of his business dealings with other people prior to his murder.
Chris Marquis made enemies by not living up to the agreements that he had made with individuals on purchasing and selling of CB sets and other various equipment.
Customers told police that Chris would promise to send one model of CB radio, but after he received payment, would ship another lower-priced radio.
Obviously, a number of these individuals were upset over this, and therefore it was necessary for the investigation to locate and interview these individuals in order to determine if that anger rose to the level where they would do such a violent crime.
With hundreds of customers, investigators now had hundreds of suspects. Investigators discovered that the package was shipped by the United Parcel Service from Mansfield, Ohio. The name and town on the return address were both fictitious. At the crime scene, investigators sifted through the debris looking for evidence.
An extensive search was required. We are meticulously going through every room where any piece of evidence that we're looking for, a wire, a tool, a hex nut. We are taking sweepings and going room to room.
Bomb experts say bombs are unique, that each bomber has a signature style. And the bomb that killed Chris Marquis had a signature all its own.
One of the things that we knew from the murder scene was that small brass hex nuts had been included in the bomb that killed Chris Marquis. So the FBI and ATF agents in the search were looking for hex nuts that might be physically consistent with the hex nuts in the bomb.
Investigators also found pieces of styrofoam used to pack the bomb, a piece of the battery used to detonate it, and they were able to identify the chemical makeup of the gunpowder used in the explosion. But all of these items were available in any hardware store or gun shop. The bombing death of Chris Marquis made the national news.
The witness realized that he had information that was important to law enforcement. It was at that point that the cooperating witness contacted law enforcement to relay his information that he had.
The informant told investigators that a long-distance truck driver in Indiana, Christopher Dean, had purchased a CB radio from someone through the internet and was angry about it.
This witness informed the FBI that he was present in a discussion with Mr. Dean when he spoke of his problems with the sale of a CB radio and a young man in Vermont.
There was information that he'd said he was going to come to Vermont and, beat up Mr. Marquis.
When questioned, Dean confirmed he had purchased a CB radio from Chris Marquis for $400 and had been sent a cheaper model instead.
Mr. Dean was very angered. At one time, his wife actually called Christopher Marquis and indicated that her husband was quite upset and may be traveling to Vermont, and that he would not be very happy if he did.
There was a lot of phone calls. And a lot of times I would answer the phone and he'd ask for my son. And Chris would say, I'm not here. He'd give me the motion. He didn't want to answer the phone call.
Sheila admitted her son didn't return Dean's money. But Dean denied sending the bomb. He had no prior criminal record, and he lived in Indiana. The package had been shipped from Ohio.
He was described as a very hardworking person, reliable, honest, had a very loving family. He had plenty of friends and neighbors who trusted him, who thought he was a generous, regular guy.
Investigators wondered whether forensic evidence in Dean's home would contradict his story.
I can't really believe that somebody would do this. Chris was my pride and joy. He was my youngest child. They say that you have to forgive. And because of my religion, I believe I do have to forgive. But I don't think I've come to that yet.
Armed with a warrant, investigators searched Christopher Dean's home, their prime suspect in the bombing death of Chris Marquis.
We are looking everywhere that any place a hex nut could be, a wooden clothespin, thumbtacks, batteries, any type of insulating materials, as well as taking sweepings from carpet, looking for powders, anything that may have held any type of explosive powders.
In Christopher Dean's basement, they found hex nuts similar to those used in the fatal bomb. To find out if they were the same, analysts used a process known as plasma atomic emission spectroscopy. They took samples from the hex nuts found with the bomb and those found in Dean's house. These samples were dissolved in a neutral chemical solution, which was then vaporized at extremely high temperatures. Different components like zinc and copper will vaporize at different speeds, all of which is monitored by a computer. Investigators concluded the hex nuts had the same chemical makeup.
Identical hex nuts from a metallurgical point of view were recovered from Mr. Dean's residence. They were stored in a container near his workbench, where we allege the bomb was constructed.
In the rest of the house was even more evidence. Investigators found the same type of wiring used in the bomb's detonator. They found the same type of pipe used in the fatal bomb. And the same type of styrofoam packing material was discovered in Dean's garage.
This pipe bomb used smokeless powder. One of the things we were looking for was powder like that. Now, interestingly enough, there was no container of powder found.
But in the kitchen, investigators found a small plastic funnel that looked like it might contain a clue.
That funnel, we could visibly see that there appeared to have been some type of powder used in that.
The powder was analyzed using a scanning electron microscope that uses X-rays to reveal its chemical components. That sample was compared to the powder found at the bomb scene. Both samples were smokeless gunpowder, and both had a 17% concentration of nitroglycerin in addition to the stabilizing component nitrocellulose.
The smokeless powder matched the smokeless powder from the murder bomb and from the smokeless powder we found inside his house.
But there was a problem. All of these items in Dean's home were available at stores in every state in the country. There was nothing unique or unusual about the gunpowder, the pipe, or the hex nuts. Investigators knew that sometimes the tiniest piece of evidence is the most telling, so they returned to the bomb scene. Among the thousands of pieces of debris, they found a mangled 9-volt battery. With a magnifying glass, investigators saw a series of numbers and letters on the side of the battery. 3G24, G205. A call to the manufacturer revealed this was a lot number that identified the day and the assembly line on which the battery was assembled. Inside Christopher Dean's home, investigators found an open pack of the same brand of 9-volt batteries with one missing. The lot numbers on the unused batteries were the same as the one used to detonate the pipe bomb.
And that lot number meant that those batteries were manufactured at the same day on the same line.
Just when prosecutors thought their case against Dean would primarily be circumstantial, a computer forensic expert found even more evidence inside Chris Dean's computer. It was a file Dean thought he had deleted, but hadn't. Prosecutors found evidence that Christopher Dean ordered a CB radio from Chris Marquis and sent a check for $400. But Marquis sent a less expensive CB radio than the one Dean ordered.
The motive for Mr. Dean's actions in this murder of Christopher Marquis appears to be, unfortunately, his extreme anger over the fact that Christopher Marquis swindled him out of a $400 CB radio.
There was one last item in Chris Dean's home investigators needed to evaluate: his computer. A computer forensic analysis uncovered evidence that Dean had recently downloaded information on how to build a pipe bomb.
If an investigator were looking for evidence of searches for pipe bomb material on the internet, it is not difficult to locate, especially if the computer user himself is not savvy in how to cover his tracks.
And on the hard drive of his computer, there was a copy or template of the label used on the box that held the pipe bomb, with the same fictitious return address that was found on the pipe bomb package. Mr. Dean attempted to delete the file, but remnants of the file were still on the computer's hard drive.
He probably thought he covered his tracks and deleted all the files. However, because he printed it, the computer generated a second file on the system for the printer, and that is what was found.
It would be remarkable for anybody else to have made up the exact name and exact address that was contained on Christopher Dean's computer.
I characterized this computer label as a computer fingerprint. It was conclusive in my mind that somebody had, that this bomb was associated with that house. That somebody had created the address label used in this bomb at the Dean residence.
Christopher Dean was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Prosecutors had plenty of evidence to prove Dean chose violence as a way to resolve his dispute with Chris Marquis. In making the bomb, Dean unwittingly used a 9-volt battery which identified the date and the factory in which it was manufactured, a battery which matched the ones found in his home. Logs from Mr. Dean's trucking company indicated he was in Mansfield, Ohio, on the day the fatal package was sent.
We even went a step further than that. The witness at the UPS facility in Ohio identified Christopher Dean as the person who shipped that box.
We were able to compare the handwriting on the UPS receipt with Mr. Dean's handwriting, and handwriting experts would say that it was the same person.
And Dean had no idea he was dealing with a teenager.
They communicated over the internet and a little bit over the telephone, so they'd never met each other. Mr. Dean didn't know what Mr. Marquis looked like, didn't know he was a 17-year-old boy.
In February of 2000, Christopher Dean pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Sheila Rockwell, there was little satisfaction in the sentence. She still bears the scars of the bomb that killed her son. She limps from the shrapnel that tore through her leg, and her hands will never recover from the blast. But mostly, she mourns the loss of her 17-year-old son.
Why? Why would anybody ever do this over CB radio? You know, if only I had known, I would try to, reason with Dean. Pay him for the radio, send him back the radio, whatever the case may be. But it was just unbelievable that somebody that crazy would do something like that.
Sitting here today, I still can't fathom how one person would be of a mindset that just because they got ripped off for a couple $100, that they'd want to kill somebody that they'd never seen before.
For investigators, the case proved something that Christopher Dean never thought possible. He was convinced that since he'd never been to Vermont and he had never met Chris Marquis, that no one could tie him to the fatal bomb. But he never realized forensic science would identify him. The materials he used to build the bomb, the lot numbers on the batteries, and the fictitious name and address that was recovered from his computer left no doubt that he was the one who killed Chris Marquis.
Well, we had a lot of evidence in this case, but the forensic evidence, to me, was the linchpin of the prosecution. And we not only had one piece of forensic evidence, but we had many, many different kinds of forensic evidence.
It was just amazing the way that they had pinpointed the paper wrapper, the styrofoam, the bomb, everything that he had put in the bomb, the hex nuts, were all right back to the manufacturer. It was unbelievable that science was that good.
No one in this quiet residential community saw or heard anything unusual on the day a neighbor was brutally attacked. But a store's security camera, a fingerprint, and forensic computer analysis helped to identify a suspect in another state within 12 hours of the crime. In 1997, Escaline DeBoard moved to a residential neighborhood in Knoxville, Tennessee. She lived just a few blocks away from her daughter and grandson.
So as soon as I became pregnant, she moved to Knoxville to be with me. She was very family-oriented. She liked being with her children.
The area was virtually crime-free.
If you were to match up the different sectors of this county, I think most everybody in Knox County would agree with you that it's one of the safest places in our county.
They're all families, lots of children in the neighborhood, nice yards, picket fence, the quintessential American story, very nice.
Escaline worked at home, using her computer to type medical transcriptions for the University of Kentucky. She spent the rest of her free time with her family.
My mother saw my child every day, and they talked on the phone numerous times. She would miss him. She'd have to walk the 2 blocks from her house to my house because she said, I need a grant fix. I've got to be with him.
Late in the afternoon, on August 20th, 2001, Liz realized she hadn't heard from her mother since talking to her that morning.
She always called me around 5:30. If she wasn't at my house, she would always at least call around 5, right before dinner, 5 or 5:30, and I hadn't heard from her. So around 6:30, I began to get concerned.
Calls to Escaline's home went unanswered and weren't picked up by her answering machine.
So I got in my car and drove to her house, and her door was locked and the blinds were closed. My mother loved lights, so this looks different. So I used my key to walk in, and that's when I found her on the floor.
Her mother had been murdered.
Was the door locked when you came in? Yes. Things are just all over the place. And her wallet is out of her purse, and there's credit cards strewn all over the floor. They've gone through things. The phone was unplugged down here. That's why her answering machine didn't pick up. And they've gone through cabinets, and her back window's closed. Mama. Mama. Oh, Mama. Oh, God.
The house had been ransacked, and it appeared as if someone had gone through Escaline's jewelry. The bruises and cuts on her hands and arms were defensive wounds indicating she had fought her attacker. Escaline's wallet was empty, and while some of her credit cards were found on the carpet, most of them were missing.
He took everything out of the wallet, took time to look at every little piece of paper in the wallet, and found the PIN code numbers for the credit cards.
Investigators found no signs of forced entry.
It told us it was a possibility that she knew the person or that for some reason they surprised her at the front of the house and that the door was opened for whoever this was?
Well, I really didn't know. First impression would be someone that she knew because of no forced entry.
But Escaline's daughter didn't believe it.
She was so reserved, she was very quiet, and again, a very, very easygoing person. I could never imagine anybody knowing her, anybody she knew would want to hurt her.
In the kitchen, investigators found a soda can, a drinking glass, and a cigarette butt on the floor.
This perpetrator had spent a considerable amount of time in the residence, had taken time to eat some food and drink some cola, and just was in control.
Liz also told detectives her mother's car was missing.
We were able to relay to other agencies throughout the area to be on the lookout for her vehicle, because we only could assume that whoever had murdered Escaline DeBoard also had her vehicle.
Investigators canvassed the whole neighborhood, but no one had heard or seen anything unusual.
In a matter of probably 20 minutes of my arriving on the scene, I had somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 65 people working on that crime.
Unfortunately, if it's not solved within a 24-hour after the fact, things can happen very quickly. Evidence can be destroyed. The case is getting cold very quickly.
In time, they would discover an important clue inside Escaline DeBoard's computer. There were no signs of forced entry at Escaline DeBoard's home. But her daughter Liz told police that her mother often left her front door unlocked.
Trying to make it easier for me. If I had something in my hands or I was holding my son, I could just come in and not have to fiddle with keys and thinking about me.
There were plenty of clues in the townhouse.
We found latent prints on two glasses. The location of the prints on the glasses led us to believe, or did confirm, that someone had a hold of the top of the glasses carrying those in there.
The prints were entered into the automated fingerprint identification system known as AFIS and compared to millions of prints in a nationwide database. The search did not immediately produce a match.
Sometimes it takes a matter of hours, maybe even days, because you're looking at several million entries.
The biological samples from the rape test kit were sent to the forensics lab for testing. First, the sample was placed into a vial with a stain extraction buffer, which breaks down all non-biological particles and proteins surrounding the DNA. Phenochloroform was then added, allowing the DNA to congeal. And this was analyzed using a polymerase chain reaction test. The result was believed to be the killer's DNA profile. Next, forensic analysts examined Escaline's computer, and with the help of her employer's mainframe computer, found an important clue.
When we looked at Escaline DeBoard's computer, we discovered that she had sent out an email at 12:21, the day that she was found dead. That led us to believe that she was alive and obviously had been working on her computer prior to whoever had entered her home, before she had contact with them.
And investigators found evidence that Escaline's computer had automatically logged off 3 minutes after sending that email. That meant the time of her death was sometime after 12:30.
We were trying to get a time frame for the death itself. We were also trying at the same time to learn if there was anything out of the normal in the community.
Neighbors told police there were magazine salesmen going door to door on the afternoon of Escaline's murder.
Many people relayed to us that these people had been in their residence or in their subdivision during the time of 11 in the morning up till almost 4 p.m.
Local ordinances require sales organizations to have permits for each and every salesman selling door to door, but there had been no permits granted to any sales groups that week. Sheriff Tim Hutchison knew that traveling sales groups from out of state usually stay at local motels. Typically, a company van would pick them up at the motel in the morning, take them to a neighborhood to sell door to door, and then take them back to the motel at the end of the day.
We've had problems in the past with some of these people being very pushy, trying to push themselves in on women and getting in arguments or fights. And so that set an alarm bell off the minute that the word came back to us at the scene that there were some magazine salesmen in the neighborhood that afternoon.
Detectives canvassed several local motels but turned up nothing. Back at the crime scene, investigators followed another lead. Escaline's wallet was empty, and her daughter told them it was normally full of credit cards. Detectives thought the intruder may have stolen them and tried to use them.
So we started looking through the drawers, trying to find past bills which would have those credit card numbers on them, which companies that they were with. And so by doing that, we found which cards were missing.
Police asked the bank to notify them if anyone tried using one of those stolen cards. They never dreamt that the killer would walk right into their trap. Only a few hours after Escaline DeBoard's murder, officials at her bank told police that someone tried to use one of her credit cards at an ATM at a local gas station.
We retrieved about, I think, $80 or so out of the ATM.
Detectives checked the ATM's surveillance video. They saw a tall, thin man wearing a white shirt and black tie standing at the machine for 8 minutes. Afterwards, he picked up a drink and went to the counter to pay for it. It appeared that he was asking the store clerk for directions.
Whoever used Escaline DeBoard's card was dressed wearing the white shirt and black tie, led us to believe that it was one of the magazine salesmen who in fact had been in her residence. All the neighbors we spoke to said the magazine salesmen that came to the residence were wearing white shirts, black ties.
Detectives questioned the store clerk, and she clearly remembered the customer. He told her he was from New York City and asked for directions to the motel on Paper Mill Road. Police went immediately to the motel, and they spotted 2 vans similar to those used to transport the traveling salesman. Across the street, police also saw Escaline DeBoard's car, which was immediately processed for fingerprints.
When we spoke with the magazine salesmen that were at the Super 8, we discovered that one of the magazine salesmen didn't show up for their pickup point at 4 p.m.
That salesman was 21-year-old Roger Broadway.
When we first spoke with the manager of the magazine salesman, he was reluctant to give us information.
When the sheriff threatened to impound his vans, the supervisor changed his mind.
He started telling us that there was one individual that worked for him that was from New York City that had got word that his relatives were sick, and he immediately needed to leave to go back home.
The manager admitted that they recruited salesmen with criminal records, but claimed that they were rehabilitated.
The manager of the magazine salesman told us that many of the people that they hire are from halfway houses in inner cities, just to give them the opportunity to make some money and get out of the city.
Roger Broadway told his employer that he had a family emergency and needed to go back to New York City immediately.
The manager took Roger Broadway to the bus station, purchased him a bus ticket, and sent him on a bus back to New York.
Police knew they needed to catch Broadway before he got off that bus.
If he'd have made it back to New York, where it was from, it'd be really impossible to find him there.
He's on home turf then. And those people, if they know you're after them, they can hide out for long, sometimes long periods of time.
He would have went underground, I'm sure.
A background check revealed that Roger Broadway had served a prison term for aggravated robbery. Detectives checked with the bus company and were told the bus would take Interstate Highway 81 to New York. And they also told police exactly where the bus would be during its journey. Shortly after midnight, police asked sheriff's officers in Virginia to try to intercept that bus. Sheriff's deputies were able to catch up with the bus they believed was carrying Roger Broadway on Interstate 81 in Virginia. When they pulled the bus over and sheriffs walked on board, Roger Broadway surrendered without incident. In his luggage, investigators found bloody clothing, Escaline DeBoard's engagement ring, and her car key.
He held something in his pocket that my mother wore, and it was violating, I guess. The experience I had was a very violating experience, that he would even touch something that was hers, that touched her, I suppose.
Broadway's fingerprints were compared to those on the drinking glass at the crime scene and on Escaline's car window. A computer program identified small shapes within the fingerprints called minutiae, shown here in green squares. Hundreds of these points matched.
Those prints belong to the suspect, Roger Broadway.
Investigators took a blood sample from Broadway for DNA testing. As expected, Broadway's DNA profile matched the biological samples at the crime scene.
The scientist told us that the odds of this being incorrect, the odds were greater than the population of the world.
Based on the forensic evidence, prosecutors believe Broadway entered Escaline DeBoard's unlocked townhouse intending to burglarize it, not knowing she was upstairs. Escaline was working upstairs on her computer, and she sent her last email at 12:21. The computer logged off 3 minutes later. Escaline must have heard someone downstairs and gone to investigate.
What you doing there? Go.
After a scuffle, Broadway killed Escaline, then cut the telephone cords. Before he left, Broadway helped himself to a soda and cigarettes. He took Escaline's credit cards and her car, then drove to the ATM for cash and directions. He never realized the store's security camera, normally used to prevent robbery, in this case, helped solve a murder. Broadway then ditched the car, told his supervisor he needed to leave town, and took the first bus to New York City.
I suspect a number of our more senior citizens that live alone would have been terrified that there was a madman on the loose. So we were very fortunate that we didn't have to live through that and try to calm the fears of a number of our citizens here.
When he saw the amount of forensic evidence, Roger Broadway pled guilty to murder and aggravated robbery. In return, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole, plus 50 years.
Roger Broadway showed no remorse for what he had done. And to me, I think he received the best penalty that was available to him. And I hope he has the rest of his life to think about that.
Liz Knopfsinger wears her mother's engagement ring to keep the memory of her always with her.
I love you. I miss you. That's about the only thing I can say to my mom right now. I wish you were here.
But she says she will not allow a killer to ruin what remains of her family.
I don't want my son to remember his grandmother that way, and I don't want to remember my mother that way. I want to remember her how she lived. I don't want to remember her how she died.
Officials in Tennessee have introduced legislation to regulate companies who use convicted felons as door-to-door salesmen.
No one here knew that this convicted violent felon was in our neighborhood selling and working. And so we would like to see a law on the books where the people must register with local law enforcement if they have a criminal record.
I would like to feel as though I had something to do with changing the industry and making it safer. So if someone does knock on your door, they are licensed and bonded and they have identification with their picture on it.
Even if those laws were to be passed, detectives warn people to be extremely careful when dealing with door-to-door salesmen.
You don't know their backgrounds, you don't know what they're capable of, you really don't know what their intentions are once they get into your home. So I would strongly advise not allowing people into your residence that you don't know.
Lock your doors. I don't care where you live, how safe it is. This is a safe community where murders never occur, but it did here.
Forensic computer analysis, DNA testing, fingerprint analysis, and the store's security camera all work together to solve a case within 12 hours of the crime.
The collection of that evidence, the way it was collected here, the way it was preserved, maintained, is a textbook example of how any investigation, and particularly a homicide investigation, should be run.
Thank goodness that we do, that we have the technology and the tools to be able to do that. So it's essential that the forensics, the science, is a part of the process.
In a small Texas town where everyone seemed to know everyone, there was one house people eventually stopped driving past after dark. The house was empty. The windows were boarded. The front porch sagged beneath years of heat and rain. But for decades, one question remained attached to that property like a shadow. What happened to Daniel Mercer on the night of October 17th, still 1987? At 11:42 p.m., a telephone rang inside the Mercer home. Nobody answered. The call ended. Then the phone rang again. Still nothing. By sunrise, Daniel Mercer was gone. His truck was missing. His front door stood open. A cup of coffee sat untouched on the kitchen table, and beside it was a folded newspaper with one sentence circled in blue ink. Nobody understood why. Nobody could explain who had circled it. And nobody knew that the answer would remain buried for nearly 4 decades. Daniel was 31 years old. He worked as a mechanic at a small repair shop outside town. He was known as quiet, reliable, and almost painfully predictable. He opened the shop at 7 every morning. He ate lunch at the same diner. He drove the same route home. On Friday nights, he usually stayed in. He was not a man who disappeared. That was what made the case so disturbing. His younger sister, Rebecca, was the first person to realize something was wrong. Daniel had promised to meet her for breakfast on October 18th. He never arrived. At first, she assumed he had overslept. Then she called the house. No answer. She drove there. The front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal. His wallet was gone. His keys were gone. His jacket was missing. But his watch remained on the kitchen counter. Rebecca knew immediately that something was wrong. Daniel never left home without wearing it. Police arrived at 8:16. The first officer walked through the house and found no obvious signs of violence. No blood. No broken furniture. No overturned chairs. No signs of forced entry. The bedroom was untouched. The bathroom was untouched. The kitchen looked as if someone had simply stood up and walked away. Then officers noticed the truck was gone. That changed the situation. Daniel had disappeared voluntarily, or someone had made it look that way. The truck was a dark green 1984 Ford pickup. It was eventually found nearly 18 miles away beside an abandoned feed warehouse. The driver's door was unlocked. The keys were still inside. The driver's seat was pushed farther back than Daniel normally kept it. On the floor was a single work glove. On the passenger seat was a receipt from a gas station. The time printed on it was 10:58 p.m. That meant Daniel had been alive less than an hour before the truck was abandoned. Investigators went to the gas station. The attendant remembered him, or thought he did. He remembered a man buying cigarettes, but he could not swear it was Daniel. The store's security camera had been broken for months. There was no footage. The receipt was the only proof that someone had been there. The investigation quickly expanded. Detectives searched the roads between Daniel's house and the warehouse. They found tire tracks near an old dirt road. One set belonged to Daniel's truck. Another belonged to a larger vehicle. A second vehicle had apparently followed him, but the tracks were badly damaged by a storm that came through the next morning. Rain erased the tread pattern. The evidence disappeared beneath mud. The case became a mystery before the first week had even ended. Daniel's family insisted he had been taken. His co-workers disagreed. One co-worker said Daniel had been nervous for several days. Another said he had seemed completely normal. A third remembered Daniel asking whether anyone had been calling the shop asking for him. That detail suddenly mattered. Detectives checked the telephone records. 3 calls had been made to the repair shop during the week before Daniel disappeared. All came from payphones. All were brief. None could be traced. Then investigators found something else. Daniel had withdrawn $600 from his bank account 2 days before his disappearance. That was a large amount of cash in 1987. His family knew nothing about it. His sister assumed he had planned to buy something. Police searched his financial records. There was no purchase, no new vehicle, no equipment, no hotel, no plane ticket. The money had simply vanished with him. For investigators, the simplest theory became that Daniel had planned to leave town. Maybe he owed someone money. Maybe he was involved in something his family did not know about. Maybe he had a secret relationship. Maybe he had been threatened. But then they found his passport, still inside the house. His birth certificate was there. His extra bank cards were there. His favorite jacket was there. The things a person would normally take when leaving were still in the house. Daniel had not packed. He had simply disappeared. 3 days later, police received an anonymous phone call. The caller was a man. His voice was low. He said only, "Stop looking near the warehouse." Then he hung up. Detectives traced the call. It came from a payphone outside a grocery store. The phone had been wiped. No fingerprints were recovered. Police canvassed the area. Nobody remembered seeing anyone. The case became the biggest story in town. Local newspapers printed Daniel's photograph. Volunteers searched fields. Farmers opened barns. Hunters checked remote roads. The sheriff organized teams to search the river. Nothing. No body. No clothing. No weapon. No explanation. Weeks became months. Months became years. The investigation slowly lost momentum. The anonymous call was never solved. The $600 was never recovered. The second vehicle was never identified. And the circled newspaper sentence remained unexplained. For years, investigators believed the sentence might have been a clue. The newspaper was dated October 17. The circled article concerned a local construction project, a new highway bypass. The project was controversial because it would cut through several rural properties. Daniel had no known connection to the project. At least that was what investigators believed. Then, 17 years later, a retired surveyor contacted the sheriff's office. He remembered Daniel. He remembered seeing him near the construction site several times in 1987. The surveyor said Daniel had been arguing with someone. He could not remember who, but he remembered one phrase: "You can't keep doing this." The surveyor had assumed it was a dispute over property. Now detectives wondered if it was something more. The construction project had involved several contractors. One contractor had been accused of falsifying inspection records. Another had disappeared from the project shortly before Daniel vanished. His name was Charles Rayner. Rayner had moved out of Texas in 1988. He had never been interviewed. Investigators located him decades later in another state. He was alive, older, retired. And when detectives mentioned Daniel's name, he became visibly uncomfortable. He claimed he barely remembered him. Then detectives asked whether he had ever driven a dark blue Chevrolet pickup. Rayner said no, but old employment records showed he had used one, a vehicle that matched the second set of tire impressions found near the dirt road. Suddenly, a 40-year-old question had a new direction. Daniel may not have disappeared randomly. He may have been investigating something connected to the construction project, something that someone wanted kept quiet. But investigators still had no body, no weapon, no confession, no direct physical evidence. Only a growing collection of strange details. The anonymous phone call, the missing cash, the second vehicle, the newspaper article, the argument near the construction site, and now a contractor who claimed not to remember Daniel. Then came the discovery that changed the case completely. In 2026, workers renovating an abandoned property outside town found a rusted metal toolbox buried beneath an old concrete slab. Inside was a mechanic's wrench, a photograph, and a small piece of paper sealed inside plastic. Written on the paper were 4 words, "Daniel knows too much." The handwriting was faded, but investigators had something to compare it with, an old employment form. And when the handwriting specialist placed the 2 samples side by side, the room went silent. The writing appeared to match Charles Rayner. For the first time in 39 years, investigators had something more powerful than a theory. They had a name. And that name was about to turn a forgotten disappearance into a shocking cold case investigation that would force a small Texas town to confront a secret it had buried for decades. The handwriting comparison was not enough to make an arrest. Mercer knew that. A match between 2 pieces of handwriting could point investigators toward a suspect, but it could not tell them what happened to Daniel on the night he vanished. It could not prove who buried the toolbox. It could not explain why the note had been sealed inside plastic and hidden beneath concrete. And most importantly, it could not answer the question that had haunted the Mercer family since 1987. Where was Daniel? The sheriff's office kept the discovery quiet. No press conference, no television cameras, no dramatic announcement. The toolbox was taken to the laboratory. The concrete fragments surrounding it were photographed. Soil samples were collected. The paper was handled under controlled conditions. Every object inside the box was cataloged. The photograph was the most interesting item. It showed 6 men standing beside a construction trailer. The image was badly faded. 5 men were easily identified. The 6th was Daniel. He was standing near the far end of the group, holding a folder against his chest. Beside him stood Charles Rayner. On the back of the photograph was a date, October 9th, Sill, 1987. 8 days before Daniel disappeared, investigators enlarged the image. Daniel appeared tense. Rayner appeared to be looking directly at him. Neither man was smiling. At first, the photograph seemed to confirm what investigators already suspected. Daniel and Rayner knew each other. But then a forensic analyst noticed something in Daniel's hand. The folder contained several pages. One page was partially visible. A number had been written across the top. Investigators searched old construction records. Project 417 was not a highway project. It was an internal code used for a disputed drainage contract. The contract had been awarded to a company connected to Rayner. The records showed unusually large payments. Several invoices had been altered. Materials listed as delivered could not be located. Equipment charges appeared twice, and one name appeared repeatedly in the paperwork. Daniel Mercer. He was not a contractor. He was not a surveyor. He was a mechanic. Why had a mechanic been examining construction invoices? That question led investigators back to Daniel's former workplace. The repair shop had been sold twice since 1987. The original owner was dead. The building had been remodeled, but an old storage room remained untouched. Inside, investigators found boxes of receipts, employee records, and service orders. One box contained Daniel's handwriting. Several pages listed vehicles connected to the construction project. Rayner's pickup was there. So were 3 company trucks, and one vehicle that investigators had never considered, a black Chevrolet sedan. The service records showed that Daniel had repaired it twice. The owner was listed as J. Hale. Investigators searched the name. James Hale had been the county's assistant purchasing officer in 1987. He had approved several of the construction payments. He had also been the man responsible for reviewing the invoices Daniel had apparently been investigating. Suddenly, the case widened. Daniel may have discovered financial fraud. Rayner may have been involved. Hale may have been involved. And Daniel may have realized he was looking at something dangerous. But why would a mechanic become involved in county contract? The answer came from an old co-worker. Daniel had discovered that several vehicles used by the construction company were being repaired with parts that were never being paid for. The invoices listed expensive components. The actual repairs used cheaper parts. Daniel noticed the discrepancy. He mentioned it to his employer. Then he started asking questions. The co-worker remembered Daniel saying that the numbers did not make sense. He had believed someone was stealing money, but he had not known how high the problem went. Investigators found a handwritten note from Daniel. It was dated October 12th, Sill 1987. The note contained only one sentence. "If they know I have the copies, I'm in trouble." That sentence changed the investigation. Daniel had copies. Copies of what? Investigators searched the old storage room again. Nothing. They searched Daniel's former home. Nothing. His sister's attic. Nothing. The original police evidence inventory. Nothing. If Daniel had copies of the construction records, they were gone, unless he had hidden them somewhere. Mercer returned to the abandoned warehouse where Daniel's truck had been discovered. The property had changed hands several times. The old feed building was partially demolished. A newer structure stood nearby, but the dirt road remained. Investigators walked the area again. They found nothing. Then one detective noticed a concrete drainage channel running behind the warehouse. It had not existed in 1987, but the original construction plans showed that the channel had been installed only weeks before Daniel disappeared. The investigators compared the plans with the photograph of the construction trailer. Rayner had supervised the work. They followed the channel toward a field. At the edge of the field was a large oak tree. An old survey marker was buried nearby. The marker had been mentioned in the 1987 records. It was number 417, the same number Daniel had written on the folder. The coincidence was difficult to ignore. Investigators brought in ground-penetrating radar. The machine moved slowly over the field. Technicians watched the monitor. Most of the ground was ordinary. Then the signal changed. A rectangular disturbance appeared beneath the soil, approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, deep enough to be significant. The team marked the location. They began digging. The first layer contained nothing. Then old construction material appeared: broken concrete, rusty wire, fragments of wood. At approximately 5 feet, the soil changed color. Investigators stopped. The area was treated as a potential burial site. Forensic archaeologists were brought in. Every layer was removed carefully. Nobody spoke. Then a piece of fabric appeared, dark brown, rotten. The laboratory later determined that the material was consistent with clothing manufactured in the mid-1980s, but it was not enough to identify Daniel. The excavation continued. Another object appeared, a metal buckle, then a fragment of leather, then a human bone. The entire field was sealed. Forensic specialists worked through the night. At 3:17 a.m., the sheriff received the preliminary confirmation. Human remains had been found. The news spread through town before sunrise. For Daniel's sister, the phone call was devastating. For 39 years, she had lived with uncertainty. Now the uncertainty was gone. Daniel had been found. But the question remained: who had put him there? The forensic team recovered additional remains. They were badly degraded, but dental records provided the first identification. Daniel Mercer. 39 years after he disappeared, his family finally had confirmation. The cause of death was less clear. There was significant damage to several bones. One fracture was consistent with severe blunt force trauma, but investigators could not determine whether the injury had occurred before or after death. The medical examiner could not establish an exact cause. That meant the case still depended heavily on circumstantial evidence. Then the laboratory examined the clothing: a jacket fragment, a work shirt, a belt, and a small piece of fabric that appeared to come from another garment. The fabric contained DNA. One profile belonged to Daniel. The second was male. It did not match Daniel. Investigators compared it with Rayner. The result was inconclusive. The DNA was too degraded, but the laboratory found something else. A partial profile was consistent with a close male relative of Rayner. That was not enough for identification. It was not enough for an arrest, but it gave investigators a direction. Rayner had two brothers. One had died in 2004. The other was still alive. His name was Michael Rayner. Investigators contacted him. He agreed to provide a DNA sample. The sample excluded him. The family connection remained unresolved. Then investigators learned that Charles Rayner had a son. His name was Eric. Eric had been 19 years old in 1987. He had worked occasionally around the construction project. His name appeared nowhere in Daniel's original case file, but his vehicle records revealed something startling. Eric had owned a dark blue Chevrolet pickup, the same type of vehicle described by the truck driver, the same type seen near the quarry road, and the same type of vehicle investigators believed had followed Daniel's truck. Eric was questioned. He denied knowing Daniel. He denied being near the warehouse. He denied owning the pickup in October 1987. Investigators produced the registration record. Eric stared at it. Then he changed his answer. He said he had borrowed his father's truck. He could not remember where he went. He said it had been almost 40 years. The interview ended without an arrest, but the investigation had changed again. Now there were two generations connected to the case. Charles Rayner, his son Eric, the construction project, the missing records, the buried toolbox, the hidden note, the burial site, and Daniel's final weeks. Investigators searched Eric's employment records. He had worked at the same construction company for 6 months. His name appeared on payroll documents. But there was another discovery. Eric had been paid cash for a job on October 18th, SIL 1987. The payment was listed as equipment transport. No vehicle was specified. The amount was unusually high, and the payment had been authorized by Charles Rayner. Investigators wondered whether Eric had helped move something that night. Perhaps equipment. Perhaps construction material. Perhaps something much worse. Then the handwriting analysis came back. The note inside the toolbox appeared consistent with Charles Rayner, but the report included a warning. The sample was too short for absolute identification. It was an indication, not proof. Prosecutors refused to authorize an arrest. They needed more. Mercer returned to the old construction records. He searched for every document signed by Rayner. Then he searched for documents signed by Eric. One signature caught his attention. It appeared on a delivery receipt dated October 18th, SIL 1987. The delivery was for concrete. The location was the abandoned warehouse. The quantity was enormous, but the warehouse had never received the concrete. The delivery truck driver was still alive. He remembered the job. He remembered being told to dump the concrete near the drainage channel. He remembered arriving late. He remembered two men waiting. One was Charles Rayner. The other was younger. The driver could not identify him, but when shown a photograph of Eric Rayner, he paused. "I think that's him." The detective asked what happened next. The driver remembered that Charles told him to leave the concrete and come back the following morning. The driver did, but the next day the concrete was gone. No explanation. No paperwork. No record. For decades, nobody had connected that delivery with Daniel's disappearance. Now investigators had a possible reason. The concrete may have been used to conceal something. The question became whether the buried site had once been covered. Ground scans showed disturbed soil beneath the field. The excavation team found fragments of old concrete mixed with the burial layer. That suggested the area had been altered after Daniel was buried. But who did it? Charles? Eric? Both? Investigators still could not say. Then the sheriff received an unexpected call. It came from an elderly woman named Patricia Cole. She had lived near the warehouse in 1987. She had never spoken publicly about Daniel's disappearance. She said she remembered hearing shouting the night he vanished. She remembered a truck. She remembered two men. And she remembered something else. A woman had been there. Investigators drove to her home. Patricia described seeing 3 people near the warehouse around 11 that night. 2 men, 1 woman. The woman was arguing with someone, but Patricia could not see her face. She remembered hearing Daniel's name. Then she heard a vehicle start. The woman drove away. The 2 men remained. Patricia had assumed it was a family dispute. She never called police. 39 years later, she realized the timing matched Daniel's disappearance. Investigators asked whether she could identify either man. She looked at old photographs. She pointed to Charles Rayner. Then she pointed to his son, Eric. The room became silent. For the first time, a witness had placed both men near the warehouse on the night Daniel disappeared, but there was still something strange. Patricia insisted the woman had been alive when she left. She said the woman drove away. If that memory was accurate, then investigators had another question. Who was the woman? And why had nobody ever mentioned her? They searched Daniel's records. They found a name, Jennifer Hale, the daughter of County Purchasing Officer James Hale. Jennifer had worked briefly at the construction office. She had also been romantically involved with Daniel. The relationship had ended months before his disappearance. Investigators found 3 letters from Jennifer to Daniel. The final letter was dated October 16th, Sill, 1987. It contained only 1 sentence. "We need to talk before they find out." Mercer stared at the sentence. The case had just changed again. Daniel had been hiding something. Jennifer knew something. The Rayner family may have known, and someone had spent 39 years making sure nobody connected those names. Now investigators had a burial site, a buried toolbox, a threatening note, a witness, a missing financial trail, a construction scandal, and a woman who may have been present on the final night. But the most disturbing discovery was still waiting inside the old county archive. A document dated October 19th, Sill, 1987, signed by James Hale. It ordered the destruction of several financial records connected to Project 417. The records were destroyed the morning after Daniel disappeared, and beneath the signature was a handwritten instruction: remove everything Mercer saw. The investigation was no longer a disappearance case alone. It was beginning to look like a cover-up, and somewhere inside that cover-up was the reason Daniel had been killed. The document changed the investigation because it was the first piece of evidence suggesting that Daniel's disappearance was not simply connected to one man. Someone had been trying to erase information. The instruction was short, cold, almost administrative: remove everything Mercer saw. There was no explanation beneath it, no signature beyond James Hale's authorization, but the timing was devastating. The instruction had been written the morning after Daniel disappeared. By the afternoon, several financial records connected to Project 417 were gone. Boxes had been emptied. Ledgers had been removed. Copies of invoices disappeared from the county archive. And yet, almost 40 years later, 1 page had survived. Mercer placed the document inside a protective sleeve. He read it again. Then again. The handwriting expert was asked to compare the handwritten instruction with known samples from James Hale. The result came back inconclusive. The writing was consistent, but there were not enough words to establish a definitive match. The prosecutor warned investigators not to overstate it. A document could suggest. A document could mislead. A document could be forged. They needed to know who had created it. So investigators went back to the archive. The county building had been renovated 3 times since 1987. Entire departments had moved. Paper records had been thrown away. Filing systems had changed, but an old storage basement remained beneath the building. The basement smelled of concrete and dust. Metal shelves covered the walls. Boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling. Investigators searched for anything related to Project 417. They found construction bids, payment records, inspection reports, property maps, and then they found a box marked Closed Contracts. Inside was a folder with Daniel's name. The folder contained copies of documents that had supposedly been destroyed. Daniel had made copies. That explained the note. He had known the records were being altered. He had kept evidence. The first page showed an invoice for materials that had never been delivered. The second showed a payment to a subcontractor that had no registered employee. The third listed a company that had been created only 6 weeks before receiving a large county payment. The company address was a vacant building. The owner was a man investigators recognized. It was Charles Rayner's brother. The money had moved through several companies. Then it had disappeared. Investigators traced the bank account. The pattern was clear. County funds went to contractors. Contractors paid consulting companies. The consulting companies transferred money into private accounts. One account belonged to James Hale. Another belonged to a business controlled by Charles Rayner. Daniel had discovered something much larger than stolen parts. He had uncovered a financial scheme, but why would that lead to murder? Investigators needed to establish whether Daniel had threatened to expose it. His sister remembered a conversation shortly before he disappeared. Daniel had told her he was worried about people at work. She had asked whether someone was threatening him. He had said, "Not directly." She remembered those words because Daniel had looked frightened. He had told her that if anything happened, she should check his garage. She had never understood why. Investigators searched the garage. The building had been sold years earlier. The new owner had renovated it. But beneath a wooden workbench, investigators discovered an old metal compartment. It had been sealed behind a panel. Inside was nothing except dust. Then a forensic technician noticed scratches around the lock. Someone had forced it open long ago. The compartment may once have contained something. The new owner had no idea. Mercer asked whether the previous owner had left anything behind. The man said no, but he remembered finding an envelope inside the wall during renovation. He had thrown it away. That envelope could have contained Daniel's missing copy. It was impossible to know. Another lead disappeared, but the investigators were no longer depending on one clue. They built a timeline. October 9th. Daniel appears in the photograph with Charles Rayner. October 12th. Daniel writes, "If they know I have the copies, I'm in trouble." October 16th. Jennifer Hale writes, "We need to talk before they find out." October 17th. Daniel receives an unknown call. October 17th, 10:58 p.m. A gas station receipt appears in Daniel's truck. October 18th. Approximately 11 p.m. A witness sees Daniel near the warehouse. October 19th. Financial records are destroyed. October 19th. Rayner's company receives an unusual payment, and then Daniel disappeared. The sequence was becoming impossible to ignore, but investigators still needed to know what Jennifer Hale knew. She had lived outside Texas for decades. She agreed to an interview. She arrived with an attorney. She was 67 years old. When Mercer placed Daniel's photograph on the table, she looked at it for several seconds. Then she began to cry. She said she had loved him. She said their relationship had ended because her father had forbidden it. Mercer asked why. She said her father believed Daniel was dangerous. Not physically, politically, professionally. He said Daniel was asking questions that could destroy people. Jennifer admitted that Daniel had shown her documents. She had seen names, payments, bank transfers. She had seen her father's signature. She said Daniel wanted to take the documents to federal investigators. Then she revealed something that had never appeared in the original investigation. Daniel had planned to meet her on October 17th, not at the warehouse, at a diner. He wanted to give her copies of the documents. Jennifer said she never went. She had been afraid. Her father had warned her not to see Daniel again. She obeyed. That decision haunted her for 39 years. Mercer asked whether she knew Charles Rayner. Jennifer nodded. She said her father had worked closely with him. She also said Daniel believed Rayner was the person responsible for moving the money. Then Mercer asked the question that mattered. "Did you see Daniel on October 17th? Jennifer looked down. Yes. The room became still. She said she had gone to the warehouse. She had changed her mind. She wanted to warn him. When she arrived, Daniel was already there. So were Charles and Eric Rayner, and her father. 4 men, 1 woman, 1 missing man. Jennifer said they were arguing. Daniel had the documents. He was holding them against his chest. Charles demanded that he hand them over. Daniel refused. James Hale told Jennifer to leave. She did not. She said Daniel looked at her and told her to go. She said he told her he would meet her later. But then something happened. Eric stepped toward Daniel. Jennifer said Daniel backed away. Then the lights near the warehouse went out. She heard a crash. She heard Daniel shout. And then she ran. She drove away. She never looked back. She never called police. She said she was terrified. Mercer asked why she had waited 39 years. She answered quietly, "Because my father made me believe they would kill me too." That statement transformed the case. For the first time, investigators had a direct witness placing 4 people at the location. But Jennifer had not seen the actual killing. She had fled before the final moments. Her testimony was powerful. It was also incomplete. Mercer asked whether she knew what happened afterward. Jennifer said no. But then she remembered something. As she drove away, she saw Charles's pickup leaving the warehouse. Eric was in the passenger seat, and another vehicle followed them. A dark green Ford. Daniel's truck. That meant Daniel's truck had not been abandoned until later. Someone had driven it away from the warehouse. The driver could have been Daniel, or someone else. The timeline suddenly changed. Daniel may have been alive after Jennifer left, or someone may have been moving his body. The investigators returned to the vehicle evidence. The driver's seat had been pushed backward. The glove had been left on the floor. The keys remained inside. A new forensic review of the original photographs found something nobody had noticed. There was a faint reddish stain on the steering wheel. The original report had called it possible rust. The physical evidence was long gone, but the photograph could still be analyzed. The stain was positioned where a hand would naturally grip the wheel. Investigators could not recover DNA from a photograph, but they could compare the location with the injuries found on Daniel's remains. The possibility of bleeding during the drive could not be excluded. Jennifer's testimony suggested someone drove Daniel's truck after the confrontation. That someone could have been Reed, could have been Charles, could have been Eric, or someone else. The case still had gaps. Then investigators found a receipt. It had been hidden inside the county archive. A towing company had billed the construction company for moving a vehicle at 11:36 p.m. on October 17th. The vehicle description was missing, but the location was the warehouse. The driver was listed as C.O. Charles Rayner. The company claimed the record was for moving construction equipment, but there was no equipment listed, only a vehicle. Mercer compared the time. 11:36 p.m. That was just 6 minutes before the phone call at Daniel's house. The timeline suddenly became terrifying. Someone may have returned to Daniel's house after the warehouse. Someone may have called his home to create the appearance that he was still expected there, or perhaps the call had nothing to do with him. Again, the case refused to give a simple answer. Investigators needed physical evidence. They returned to the warehouse. The property had been partially demolished. The concrete slab was gone, but soil beneath the slab remained. Ground-penetrating radar revealed another anomaly. This one was smaller, near the northern wall. Investigators excavated. They found a rusted metal object, a key. The key was badly corroded, but a forensic locksmith identified the type. It was consistent with a key for an older Ford truck, Daniel's truck. The family still had a spare key. The pattern was compared. It matched. The key had been buried beneath the warehouse, but investigators could not determine when. It could have been there for years. It could have belonged to Daniel. It could have been dropped accidentally, yet it was another physical connection. Then the laboratory found traces of human DNA on the key. The profile was too degraded for a full identification, but one marker was consistent with Daniel. The discovery was not enough for a courtroom, but it suggested the key had been handled by him. The question was why it had been buried. Mercer searched Daniel's original vehicle inventory. His truck had 2 keys. One was found inside the ignition. The second had never been recovered. The buried key was almost certainly the missing spare. For 39 years, nobody knew where it had gone. Now it had been found beneath the place where witnesses said Daniel was last seen alive. That was no longer an ordinary coincidence. The prosecutor began preparing a new case. But before an arrest could be made, investigators needed to know where Charles Rayner was. He had been living under his own name. He had not fled. He had not changed his identity. He had simply grown old. He lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood several states away. He had grandchildren, a retirement pension, a normal life. For decades, nobody had connected him publicly to Daniel. When investigators arrived at his house with a search warrant, his wife opened the door. She was confused. Charles was sitting in the living room. When he saw the detectives, his expression changed. He asked what they wanted. Mercer placed Daniel's photograph on the table. Charles stared at it. Then he said something nobody expected. "I thought that was over." The detectives froze. He had not been told why they were there. He had not been told Daniel's case had been reopened. He had not been told about the burial site. Yet he knew exactly what they meant. The room became silent. Charles's attorney arrived. The interview ended. But the statement had been recorded. "I thought that was over." For words that prosecutors would later argue revealed knowledge of the crime. The defense would call them ambiguous. But investigators heard something else: recognition, fear, and perhaps regret. The search of Charles's home produced no weapon, no photographs of Daniel, no documents from Project 417, nothing obvious. But in a locked cabinet, investigators found an old leather notebook. The first page contained Charles's initial. Inside were construction notes. Most were ordinary. Then investigators reached October 1987. Several pages had been removed. One remained. It contained 3 numbers. 1058, the same project number, the amount of Daniel's missing cat, the time on the gas station receipt. The page had no explanation, but the combination was extraordinary. Investigators compared the handwriting. It appeared consistent with Charles. Still, the defense could argue coincidence. The number 600 could represent a payment. 1058 could represent a work time. 417 could be a project number. Separately meaningless. Together, disturbing. Then the notebook produced another clue, a sentence written on the final page: "Move the truck before morning." Investigators compared the handwriting. Again, consistent with Charles. The date was October 17th, Sill, 1987. The case had just crossed a line. For 39 years, investigators had wondered whether Daniel had driven his own truck to the warehouse. Now they had a document apparently written by Charles instructing someone to move it before morning. The truck had been found abandoned. The receipt had been recovered. The spare key had been found beneath the warehouse, and a witness had seen Daniel's vehicle leaving the area. The pieces were beginning to connect. But there was still one enormous problem. Charles was not the only person who could have written the note. Eric had worked for him. James Hale had been involved. Jennifer had been present. There were too many people, too many possible motives, too many secrets. The case had started with one missing man. Now it had become a web of corruption, fear, and silence. And investigators were about to discover that the woman who had finally broken that silence had been hiding one final detail. Jennifer Hale had not told them everything. She had not mentioned the envelope. The envelope Daniel had given her before she fled the warehouse. She had kept it for 39 years, and inside it was a single photograph, a photograph of a bank account. The account number belonged to James Hale, but the money came from a company controlled by Charles Rayner, and the final transaction was dated October 18th, Sill, 1987, the day after Daniel disappeared. The amount was exactly $600, the same amount Daniel had withdrawn, the same number written in Charles Rayner's notebook. And suddenly, the missing money was no longer missing. It had been transferred. The question was why Daniel's money had ended up inside an account connected to the men he had been investigating, and whether Daniel had ever intended to expose them. Because if he had, then the motive for his disappearance was no longer a mystery. He had found the money. He had copied the documents. He had confronted the people involved. And on the night he disappeared, he had walked into the warehouse carrying evidence that could destroy all of them. But investigators still needed to know one thing: who delivered the final blow, who buried Daniel. and who made sure the town would spend nearly 4 decades believing he had simply vanished? The answer was hidden inside the last surviving page of Project 417, and when investigators finally recovered it, they found a name written in the margin. Not Charles Rayner, not Eric Rayner, not James Hale. A fourth name. A name nobody had expected to see. A name that would force investigators to question the entire story they thought they understood. The name in the margin was Martin Voss. For 39 years, nobody had searched for him. Not because he had disappeared, because nobody had known to look. Martin Voss had been a county accountant in 1987. His name appeared on payroll records. His signature appeared on routine financial forms. He had testified during an audit years later. He had retired quietly. He had moved to Arizona. He had never been listed as a suspect in Daniel Mercer's disappearance. Yet there it was, written beside Project 417, Martin Voss. Underneath the name were 3 numbers, 1058. The same numbers investigators had found in Charles Rayner's notebook. Mercer stared at the page. The numbers were not random anymore. They formed a trail. Daniel had withdrawn $600. Someone had transferred $600. The gas station receipt showed 10:58 p.m. The note referenced 10:58. Project 417 was the financial operation Daniel had uncovered, and now Voss's name was sitting beside all of it. Investigators immediately began reconstructing Voss's role. The old county records showed that Voss had approved payments connected to Project 417. He had signed checks. He had processed invoices. He had access to the accounts. More importantly, he had authorized a transfer of exactly $600 on October 18, SIL 1987. The payment was made to a private account. The account holder was Charles Rayner. The payment description read, "Equipment reimbursement." There was no equipment, no receipt, no delivery record, no explanation. The transfer happened less than 12 hours after Daniel disappeared. Investigators contacted Voss. He was 82 years old. He lived in a quiet retirement community outside Tucson. When detectives arrived, he was sitting on a shaded patio. He listened without interrupting. Then Mercer placed Daniel's photograph in front of him. Voss looked at it. His eyes remained fixed on the picture. "You knew him," Mercer said. Voss did not answer. "You knew Daniel Mercer." Still nothing. Then Voss finally spoke. "Yes." The word was barely audible. Mercer asked how well. Voss said Daniel had come to him about the construction records. He said Daniel believed someone was stealing county money. Voss claimed he had told Daniel to stay out of it. "Why?" "Because I knew he was right." That sentence changed everything. Voss admitted the project had been manipulated. He admitted invoices had been inflated. He admitted several payments were fraudulent, but he denied knowing about any plan to kill Daniel. He said Charles Rayner was aggressive. He said James Hale was frightened. He said everyone involved believed Daniel would eventually go to the authorities, but he insisted he had never expected violence. Mercer asked about the $600. Voss looked away. He said it was a payment. For what? He did not remember. Investigators showed him the transaction. October 18th. $600. Voss stared at it. Then he said something that stunned them. That wasn't for Daniel. Mercer asked what he meant. Voss refused to explain. His attorney ended the interview. The detectives left with more questions than answers. But Voss had confirmed one thing. The financial scheme was real, and Daniel had discovered it. That gave investigators a motive. But motive was not murder. They needed the physical connection. They returned to the evidence recovered from the warehouse. The spare key, the clothing, the toolbox, the handwritten note, the partial DNA profile. The second profile remained unidentified. Investigators submitted the profile to an expanded genetic database. Nothing happened. Then, 6 weeks later, a notification arrived. The system had produced a distant familial map. The unknown male profile was connected to a family in Texas. Not the Rayner family. Not the Hale family. Another family. The name was Voss. Investigators stopped. The partial DNA profile belonged to a relative of Martin Voss. That did not mean Martin himself had been at the warehouse. It could have been a son, a nephew, a cousin, but it narrowed the possibilities dramatically. Mercer requested a voluntary DNA sample from Voss. His attorney refused. A warrant was obtained. The sample was collected. The laboratory ran the comparison. The result was not a full match, but it was consistent with the unidentified profile. The probability was extraordinarily high that the unknown DNA came from a close male relative of Voss. Investigators searched the family. Voss had one son. His name was Peter. Peter had been 24 in 1987. He had worked for a company that supplied construction materials to Project 417. His name appeared on delivery record. He had driven trucks. He had access to the warehouse. And on October 17th, still 1987, he had signed out a company vehicle. The vehicle was never returned until the following morning. The description matched the second vehicle seen near Daniel's truck. Investigators found Peter. He was alive, 73 years old. He lived alone. When detectives asked whether he remembered Daniel, he said no. They showed him a photograph. Peter looked at it. Then he closed his eyes. I remember the truck, he said. What truck? Daniel's. The room went silent. Peter admitted he had seen Daniel that night. He said he had driven to the warehouse because his father had told him to. He said Charles Rayner was there. He said James Hale was there. And he said Daniel was angry. But Peter insisted he never saw Daniel get hurt. He claimed he left before anything happened. Mercer asked why his vehicle remained near the warehouse. Peter said Charles had borrowed it. Mercer asked why. Peter did not answer. Then Mercer asked the question that had been waiting for 39 years. Did you help bury Daniel Mercer? Peter began to cry. He said no. Then he said, I helped move something. That was not an answer, but it was enough to continue. Peter claimed Charles ordered him to drive a truck to the northern field. He said there was a heavy object covered with a tarp. He assumed it was construction equipment. He said he never looked underneath, but when investigators showed him the excavation photographs, he became visibly shaken. He pointed to the burial site. That wasn't there when I left. Mercer asked what he meant. Peter said the hole had already been dug. The hole? Yes. He said he saw it. A rectangular trench. He assumed it was for drainage work. But the next morning, concrete had been poured over part of it. Peter said he never asked why. He said he was afraid. Afraid of his father. Afraid of Rayner. Afraid of losing his job. Afraid of prison. For 39 years he said nothing. But now the old silence was collapsed. Peter gave investigators a location. Another property. A small farmhouse once owned by Charles Rayner. The house had been sold years ago. The property records were still available. Investigators obtained a search warrant. They searched the basement. Behind a false wall, they found an old metal cabinet. Inside were financial records. Several belonged to Project 417. Some contained signatures. Others contained handwritten notes. One page had Daniel's name. Beside it, problem. Another said, copies must be recovered. Another, Voss says he can handle it. The final note was dated October 17th. Tonight. Nothing else. The evidence was devastating. But the defense could still argue that the notes referred to financial documents, not murder. Then investigators found a cassette tape, an old analog recording. No label, no date. The tape was sent to forensic audio specialists. They restored it. The first sounds were indistinct. A door closing. Footsteps. A man's voice. Then Daniel. His voice was unmistakable. Give me the papers. Another voice answered. Charles Rayner. You don't understand what you're doing. Daniel replied, I understand exactly what you're doing. A chair moved. Someone shouted. Then a third voice. James Hale. Enough. The recording became chaotic. Daniel said something investigators could not initially understand. Then there was a loud impact. Silence. A second impact. Then breathing. Heavy. Fast. Someone whispered, Get the truck. The tape ended. Investigators listened again. Then again. Audio specialists isolated the voices. The first voice was consistent with Charles Rayner, the second with Daniel, the third with James Hale. But there was something else. A fourth voice, very faint. A younger man, Peter. He could be heard saying, "Dad?" Then Charles replied, "Do what I told you." The tape became the strongest evidence in the case, but the recording created a new problem. Where had it come from? Who had recorded the confrontation? There had been no known surveillance system at the warehouse, no police recording, no telephone connection. Someone had been there with a tape recorder. Investigators traced the device. The cassette had been recorded on a portable machine manufactured in 1985, a common model. But the farmhouse cabinet contained the recorder. Its battery compartment still had corrosion. The tape was inside. The machine had never been reported missing. That meant someone had intentionally preserved the record. Someone had wanted the conversation to survive. But who? The answer came from an unexpected source, Martin Voss. When detectives returned to question him, they played the tape. Voss listened. His face changed. When Daniel's voice came through the speakers, Voss looked down. When Charles spoke, he closed his eye. Then came the impact. Voss whispered, "Oh God." Mercer asked, "Who recorded this?" Voss did not answer. Who had the recorder? Still nothing. Then Voss said, "Jennifer." Mercer froze. Jennifer Hale had claimed she fled. She had never mentioned recording anything. Voss said she had carried the recorder because Daniel had asked her to document the conversation. She had hidden it inside her purse. She had placed it near the warehouse office. Then she ran. The recorder captured everything. But Jennifer had never told anyone. Why? Because she believed the men involved would kill her. Mercer contacted her again. This time, she admitted it. She had recorded the meeting. She had kept the cassette, but she had not given it to police. She had hidden it for 39 years. She finally surrendered it because she believed Daniel deserved the truth. But there was one thing she still could not explain. Why had she never revealed the recording after her father died? She said she had been ashamed. She had been afraid. And she had convinced herself that silence could not change the past. Now it could. Because the recording captured the moment Daniel was still alive. It captured the confrontation. It captured Charles giving order. And it captured the moment everything changed. Investigators enhanced the final seconds. Behind the voices, another sound emerged. A vehicle door. Then Daniel said, "Please." One word. Then silence. The room where investigators listened to the recording remained quiet long after the tape stopped. Nobody spoke. The case was no longer simply circumstantial. It had a recorded confrontation, a financial motive, a burial site, physical evidence, a witness, and a DNA connection. But prosecutors wanted more. They wanted to know exactly who had delivered the fatal blow, because the tape did not capture the killing itself. It captured only the moments before. That distinction could determine whether the case ended in conviction or another decades-long mystery. The medical examiner returned to Daniel's remains. The fracture pattern was examined again. This time, modern imaging revealed something missed during the first examination. A distinctive injury to the left side of the skull. The shape was consistent with a heavy cylindrical object. Investigators searched the farmhouse. They found dozens of tools, hammers, pipes, wrenches, metal bars. But one object was missing, a steel flashlight. Charles had owned one. His son remembered it. Peter said he had seen it at the warehouse. The flashlight was never recovered. But photographs from the original investigation showed a similar object inside Daniel's truck. It had been logged as miscellaneous tool, then lost. Another piece of evidence had vanished. Another connection appeared. And suddenly the case was no longer about whether Daniel had been murdered. That question was nearly settled. It was about how many people had participated. Who planned it? Who struck him? Who moved him? Who buried him? Who destroyed the records? Who kept silent? And who had spent 39 years pretending the night of October 17th never happened? The answer was approaching. But one final piece was still missing. The DNA. Investigators had matched Daniel's biological evidence. They had connected an unknown profile to the Voss family. They had connected the physical evidence to the Rayner property. But they still needed one definitive genetic match to identify the person who had touched Daniel's clothing that night. Then the laboratory called. The comparison was complete. The unidentified profile was not Charles Rayner. It was not James Hale. It was not Peter Rayner. The DNA belonged to someone else, someone who had never been named in the investigation, someone whose identity would shock even the detectives who had spent years rebuilding the case. And when Mercer opened the laboratory report, the name at the top of the page belonged to a person who had been standing inside the original investigation from the very beginning. The name on the laboratory report was Sheriff Harold. For several seconds, nobody in the room moved. Mercer read it again. Then he checked the case number. Then the evidence number. Then the laboratory identification. There was no mistake. The unidentified male DNA recovered from Daniel Mercer's clothing was consistent with Harold Kane, the same Harold Kane who had been sheriff in 1987, the same sheriff who had personally supervised the original search, the same sheriff whose signature appeared on the first evidence inventory, the same sheriff who had stood beside Daniel's sister and promised the town that every possible lead would be followed, and the same man who had died in 2011. Mercer placed the report on the table. The case had just turned inside out. Kane had never been considered a suspect. He had been the investigator. He had been the person responsible for protecting the evidence. He had been the person who decided which leads deserved attention. And now his DNA had appeared on evidence connected directly to Daniel. The laboratory report included an important limitation. The DNA did not prove when Kane had touched the fabric. He could have handled it during the original investigation. He could have touched evidence while examining the clothing. He could have been exposed to the material at the crime scene. That was the first explanation. And it was reasonable. In fact, it was the most obvious explanation. But Mercer knew something else. Kane had claimed he never personally handled Daniel's clothing. The original evidence log said the clothing had been collected by Deputy Frank Miller. Kane had supposedly remained outside the immediate search area. If that documentation was accurate, Kane's DNA should not have been there, unless the evidence had been handled differently, or unless someone had lied. Mercer requested the original crime scene photograph. They showed Kane standing near the evidence table, not touching the clothing, not touching the packaging, but close, very close. He had access. That alone proved nothing. Then investigators examined the chain of custody. The clothing had been collected at 2:18 p.m. It was sealed at 3:04. It was entered into evidence at 5:27. But there was a 46-minute gap between collection and sealing. The evidence had remained inside the sheriff's office. Who had access? Kane, Miller, two detectives, a clerk, and one other person, James Hale. Why had a county purchasing officer been inside the sheriff's office that afternoon? The original log did not explain it. Mercer found a handwritten note attached to the back of the evidence sheet. Mr. Hale requested private discussion with Sheriff. The note was unsigned. The meeting lasted 32 minutes. 32 minutes in the same building where Daniel's clothing sat unsealed. Mercer felt the case shifting again. If Kane had contaminated the evidence during the investigation, the DNA might mean nothing. But if Kane had deliberately handled the clothing before it was sealed, and why had James Hale been there? The investigators searched Kane's old records. His personal notebooks had been donated to the County Historical Society after his death. Hundreds of pages. Traffic stops. Domestic disputes. Arrests. Missing persons. Routine police work. Then Mercer found a page dated October 18th, Sill 1987. The handwriting was Kane. 3 sentences. Mercer case may involve county people. Keep press away from warehouse. Do not release truck information. Mercer stared at the last sentence. Why hide the truck information? The truck was one of the most important pieces of evidence. Yet Kane had ordered investigators not to release details about it. The reason became clear when they found the newspaper archive. The public had been told Daniel's truck was found abandoned near the warehouse, but the newspaper never mentioned that the passenger seat had been moved. It never mentioned the second set of tire tracks. It never mentioned the missing spare key. Those details had been withheld. That was normal investigative practice. Police often withheld evidence to prevent false confession. But Kane had also withheld something else, the anonymous phone call. The public never learned about it. Neither did Daniel's family. Mercer wondered whether Kane had deliberately kept the case quiet because he knew more than he admitted. Then the investigators found a photograph. Kane standing beside Daniel's truck. The image had been taken the morning the vehicle was discovered. Kane was wearing gloves. That was expected. But his left hand held something, a small object, a key. The photograph was enlarged. The key was unmistakable. It was the spare key, the same key later found beneath the warehouse. The investigators stared at the image. The original report had stated that the spare key was missing, but the photograph suggested Kane had possessed it. Why? How had he obtained it? The investigators searched the original evidence inventory. The key was never listed. That meant it had disappeared before the evidence was lost, or it had never been collected officially. Either possibility was disturbing. Mercer contacted Kane's surviving family. His daughter, Ellen, agreed to speak. She was 70 years old. She remembered her father bringing home unusual items from cases, not bodies, not weapons, small things, keys, wallets, photographs, objects that sometimes remained in his desk for years. She said he believed keeping certain items helped him remember cases. Mercer asked about Daniel. Ellen became uncomfortable. She remembered the name. She remembered her father talking about him. But she remembered something else. After Daniel disappeared, Kane had become obsessed with the warehouse. He visited it repeatedly, even after the official search ended. Ellen remembered asking why. Her father had said, "Because someone lied to me." Mercer asked who. Kane never told her. Then Ellen remembered a box, a wooden box her father had kept in his garage. After his death, she had thrown it away, but before doing so, she had seen something inside, a photograph of Daniel, and another photograph of Charles Rayner, the two men standing together, the same construction site, the same day. Ellen believed her father had kept them because the case bothered him. Investigators searched the family storage unit. The box was gone, but a separate folder remained. Inside was a photocopy of Kane's private note. One page contained a sentence. Daniel knew about Hale. Another. Rayner involved. Then, someone inside department helping them. The last line was underlined twice. Mercer read it slowly. Someone inside the department. If Kane knew that, why had he never exposed the person? Unless he was the person, or unless he was protecting someone. Investigators reviewed Kane's financial records. They found nothing unusual. No unexplained deposits. No large cash payments. No obvious connection to Rayner. But one transaction stood out. Kane had received a $12,000 personal loan from a local bank in December 1987. The loan was paid off in full 6 weeks later. There was no documented source for the repayment. The bank records showed the payment came through a cashier's check. The check was purchased by a company controlled by Charles Rayner. Now the connection was direct. Kane had received money from Rayner shortly after Daniel disappeared. The defense could argue it was legitimate. A loan, a personal favor, a business arrangement. But Kane was the sheriff investigating Daniel's disappearance, and Rayner was a person of interest. That was enough to trigger a deeper review. Mercer searched for the original loan paperwork. The file was missing. The bank had retained only the payment record. The agreement itself had disappeared. Another missing document. Another coincidence. Another piece of the same puzzle. Then investigators found something even more disturbing. Kane had quietly closed the original investigation in 1991. The official explanation was lack of evidence, but the private notes told a different story. Kane had written, "Enough to know what happened." Below it, "Not enough to survive." The phrase made no sense. Not enough to survive what? A prosecution? A scandal? A threat? Investigators searched the rest of the notebook. The next page had been torn out. So had the page after that. But a fragment remained attached to the binding. Only 4 words were visible. Jennifer knows the tape. Mercer froze. Kane knew about the recording Jennifer had hidden for 39 years. How could he have known? Jennifer had claimed she never told anyone, unless Kane had discovered the recorder, unless he had seen it, unless someone had told him, or unless he had been present. Mercer returned to Jennifer. He asked one question. Did you ever see Sheriff Kane at the warehouse? Jennifer's face changed. She stared at the table. Then she whispered, yes. The detectives waited. She said Kane arrived shortly after she left. She had seen his patrol vehicle in her rearview mirror. She had assumed he was responding to a call. She never thought about it again. Until now. Mercer asked why she had never mentioned it. Jennifer said she had been afraid. She had believed Kane was involved. She had believed the entire system was compromised. And she had feared that if she told the truth, she would disappear too. That was the reason she kept the tape. Not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted insurance. If something happened to her, the recording would survive. Mercer asked whether she had seen Kane speak to Charles. She nodded, but she could not hear the conversation. She remembered Kane walking toward the warehouse. Then she drove away. The timing was critical. Kane arrived after Jennifer left. Daniel was still alive when she left. The confrontation continued. And somewhere between then and the discovery of the truck, Kane entered the store. The investigators reconstructed the sequence. Jennifer leaves. Kane arrives. Charles is still there. Daniel is still alive. Then something happens. The tape captures an impact. Someone orders the truck moved. The vehicle is relocated. The body is eventually buried, and Kane somehow becomes the person controlling the official investigation. The question became unavoidable. Did Kane kill Daniel? Or did he arrive afterward? The DNA suggested contact. The financial records suggested corruption. The private notes suggested knowledge. But none of it established the exact role. Then the forensic team revisited the DNA. The profile from Daniel's clothing had originally been described as partial, but advances in testing allowed analysts to recover additional markers. The new result was astonishing. The DNA was not merely consistent with Kane, it was a direct match. The probability of an unrelated individual matching the profile was effectively negligible. The only complication was timing. The DNA could have been transferred during the investigation. So investigators examined Kane's clothing from 1987. His family had preserved an old sheriff's jacket. It was stored in an archival box. The laboratory tested it. Kane's DNA profile was confirmed. That allowed investigators to compare transfer patterns. The biological material on Daniel's clothing was mixed with traces consistent with fibers from a dark wool uniform. Kane had worn that type of uniform, but so had other officers. Again, the evidence pointed toward Kane. It did not tell investigators exactly when he touched Daniel. Then Mercer found a photograph that destroyed the contamination theory. The photograph showed Daniel's clothing before Kane arrived at the warehouse. The stain containing Kane's DNA was already visible. That meant Kane could not have deposited it during the later investigation. He had touched Daniel's clothing before the evidence was photographed, before it was collected, before it was sealed. That meant Kane had been near Daniel before police officially processed the scene. The implications were enormous. The sheriff was not simply investigating the crime. He had been at the crime scene before the evidence was documented. The town had spent 39 years believing the sheriff had been searching for Daniel. The evidence suggested he had already found him. And suddenly, the old sentence in Kane's notebook made sense. Someone inside department helping them. Kane had not been looking for the person. He had been describing himself. The investigators now had to confront the possibility that the man trusted to solve the disappearance had been part of the disappearance itself. But if Kane had participated, what? The money, the construction scheme, the destroyed records, the missing evidence, the altered timeline, the buried key, the secret recording. Everything seemed to converge. Yet one question remained. Why would a sheriff risk his career, his reputation, and eventually his freedom to protect a county corruption scheme? The answer was buried inside Kane's financial records. A payment had been made to him before Daniel disappeared. Another payment came afterward. And one final payment was made 6 months later. Each came from a company controlled by Charles Rayner. The total amount was more than $40,000. In 1987, that was a fortune. Cain had been paid. Daniel had discovered the corruption, and Cain had been positioned perfectly to make the disappearance look like a voluntary departure. But there was still one person who could connect Cain directly to the final moment: Peter Rayner, the son who had admitted moving something. Investigators brought him back for another interview. This time, they placed the DNA report in front of him, then the photograph, then the tape, then the financial records. Peter stared at the evidence. He asked for water. His hands were shaking. Mercer said, "You don't have to protect them anymore." Peter looked toward the floor. Then he whispered, "It wasn't supposed to happen." The detectives leaned forward. Peter began to speak. He said Charles had planned to scare Daniel, not kill him. The goal was to take the documents, force him to disappear for a few days, make him believe that if he talked, his family would be threatened. But Daniel resisted. He fought. Charles struck him. Once, then again. Peter said Daniel fell. There was blood. He said everyone froze. Then Sheriff Cain arrived. Peter claimed Cain, looked at Daniel, then looked at Charles, and said, "You've already crossed the line." According to Peter, Cain did not call an ambulance. He did not call police. He simply ordered them to move Daniel. Peter said the sheriff made the decision. Take him where nobody will find him. Peter began crying. Then he said the sentence that would change the case forever. Cain knew Daniel was still breathing. The room went silent. Because if that statement was true, the crime was no longer an accidental killing followed by a cover-up. It was something much darker. Daniel may have been alive when he was buried, and the sheriff may have known it. Peter had just given investigators the final piece of the motive, but he had also given them something else, a reason to reopen the original medical examination. Because if Daniel had been alive after the first blow, the remains might contain evidence that could prove it. And for the first time in 39 years, investigators were no longer asking where Daniel disappeared. They were asking how long he survived after the people responsible decided that nobody would ever find him. Peter Rayner's statement changed the temperature inside the interview room. Until that moment, investigators had been reconstructing a murder from fragments, financial records, old photographs, a hidden Cosette, DNA, a buried key, witness memories damaged by time. Every piece pointed toward the same night, but none had explained what happened in the final minutes. Now there was a witness who claimed he had seen Daniel alive after the attack. Peter sat with both hands pressed against his knee. He looked exhausted. He looked older than his 73 years, and he kept repeating the same sentence. "I thought he was already dead." Mercer asked him what made him believe that. Peter said Daniel had fallen hard. He remembered blood. He remembered Daniel's head striking the floor. He remembered Charles standing over him. But then Daniel moved. Just once. His fingers moved. His chest rose. Peter said he saw it. He said Cain saw it too. That was the moment when the entire investigation changed. Because if Daniel had still been alive, the decision to move him was no longer simply an attempt to hide an accidental death. It meant the people at the warehouse had made a conscious decision not to get help. Peter claimed Cain had looked at Daniel for several seconds. Then the sheriff said, "We can't call this in." Peter could not remember every word after that. He remembered Cain ordering Charles to get the truck. He remembered being told to bring the tarp. He remembered Daniel being lifted. He remembered Daniel making a sound, a weak sound, almost a whisper. Peter said he could not understand what Daniel was saying, but he remembered one word: Rebecca, his sister's name. That detail hit investigators harder than almost anything else. Daniel had been thinking about his family, even then, even after the attack, even while injured. His final known word may have been his sister's name. Mercer asked Peter where they took him. Peter pointed to the field, the same field where Daniel's remains had been found, the same area marked by survey point 417, the same place where the concrete had been poured, the same location connected to the missing construction records. The investigators returned to the excavation site. They reviewed every photograph, every soil layer, every fragment. The medical examiner requested permission to conduct a new examination using modern imaging. Daniel's remains were transported under controlled conditions. The first scans revealed something unexpected. There were fractures that had not been fully documented in 1987. A fracture in the ribs, a fracture near the left forearm, and evidence of a severe injury to the skull. But the most important discovery involved the teeth. There was damage consistent with a fall or impact. That alone did not prove Daniel was alive when buried, but microscopic examination of certain fractures showed biological response. The bones had been damaged around the time of death. The medical examiner could not determine whether Daniel had survived for minutes or hours, but the evidence was consistent with the possibility that some injuries occurred while he was alive. That was enough for prosecutors to reconsider the case. They wanted Peter's statement corroborated. His credibility was a problem. He was a participant. He had admitted helping move Daniel. His own freedom could depend on what he said. The defense would attack him immediately. They needed independent evidence. Mercer found it in an unexpected place, a box of old dispatch recording. In 1987, the sheriff's department had used a radio system that recorded incoming and outgoing transmission. Most tapes had been destroyed, but one reel had survived. The recording began at 11:21 p.m. on October 17th. A dispatcher received a call. The caller was Sheriff Kane. His voice sounded controlled. He said he was checking a possible disturbance near the warehouse. The dispatcher asked whether backup was needed. Kane said no. Then came a strange pause. The dispatcher asked if there was anyone injured. Kane replied, "Not that I can see." Investigators replayed the line. "Not that I can see." The phrase was disturbing because Kane had not reported finding anyone. He had not mentioned Daniel. He had not requested medical assistance. He had simply said he was checking a disturbance. The transmission ended at 11:24. The next recorded communication came at 12:17. Kane reported that the area was clear. No disturbance. No suspects. No injuries. Nothing unusual. Yet Peter's statement placed Daniel at the warehouse during that same period. The tape suggested Kane had already been there. And if Peter was telling the truth, the sheriff had deliberately misrepresented what he found. Investigators compared the recording with the private cassette from Jennifer. The voices aligned. Kane was at the warehouse. Charles was there. Daniel was there. Peter was there. And Daniel was injured. The timelines overlapped perfectly. Then investigators found something else. The sheriff's vehicle mileage. Kane's patrol car had been logged at 18,402 miles on October 17th. The following morning, the mileage was 18,439, 37 miles. The official report said Kane had driven only 12 miles that night. 37 miles meant he had traveled far beyond the warehouse. Investigators plotted possible routes. One route led from the warehouse to the field where Daniel's remains were found, then back toward town, then toward Daniel's house, then back to the sheriff's office. The mileage was not proof, but it fit. Someone had driven. Someone had moved Daniel. Someone had returned, and Kane's official report had concealed the journey. The investigation now moved beyond murder. It became an investigation into institutional corruption. Several former deputies were contacted. Most were dead. One surviving deputy agreed to speak. His name was Frank Miller. He had been the officer who collected Daniel's clothing. Miller was 80 years old. His memory was imperfect, but one detail remained sharp. He remembered Kane arriving at the warehouse before him. Miller said Kane told him to stay outside. He thought that was strange. Kane was the sheriff. Miller assumed he was protecting evidence. But when Miller finally entered, he saw blood. He also saw Daniel's jacket. Miller said Kane had already touched it. He remembered Kane holding the fabric. Miller had questioned him. Kane told him, "Don't worry about it." That statement was never written into the report. Miller said he had been afraid to challenge his superior. Then Mercer asked whether Miller had ever seen Daniel alive. Miller paused. No, but then he corrected himself. Not there. He remembered seeing Daniel earlier that evening at a gas station. Around 10:50, Daniel had been talking to someone. Miller could not see the person's face, but he remembered the vehicle. A dark Chevrolet, the same type connected to Eric Rayner. Miller said Daniel looked angry. He remembered Daniel pointing at the other person. Then both vehicles left. Minutes later, Daniel's truck appeared at the warehouse. The mystery of how Daniel reached the warehouse was finally becoming clear. He had been meeting someone. Maybe Jennifer. Maybe one of the men involved in the construction scheme. Perhaps he had been lured there. The gas station receipt was no longer simply evidence of his movements. It was a timestamp. 10:58 p.m. Daniel was alive. Less than half an hour later, Kane was reporting a disturbance. Then silence. Then the truck was moved. Then Daniel was buried. Investigators returned to the old gas station. The building still existed, although the original owner had retired decades earlier. The current owner searched the basement. There were boxes from the previous business. One contained old employee notebooks. Another contained receipts. And one contained a photograph from a 1987 community event. In the background was Daniel's truck. Beside it was the dark Chevrolet. The photograph had been taken at 10:54 p.m. for minutes before the receipt. And standing between the vehicles was Eric Rayner. Daniel had not randomly arrived at the warehouse. He had met Eric first. That meeting may have been arranged. Investigators located Eric again. This time he refused to answer questions. His attorney issued a statement denying involvement, but prosecutors had enough to subpoena his phone records from 1987. The technology was primitive. There were no mobile records, but landline calls remained. Eric had called the construction office at 9:42 p.m. He had called Charles at 10:12, and he had called the sheriff's office at 10:31. That last call was particularly disturbing. The sheriff's office log listed the call as private. No details, no dispatcher notes, no reason, but the timing was exact. 20 minutes later, Kane arrived at the warehouse. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Eric had arranged the meeting. Charles had confronted Daniel. Kane had arrived. Peter had assisted. Daniel had been injured. And then the group had moved him. But there was still one mystery. What happened to the documents Daniel carried? The missing copies were never found. Investigators believed they had been destroyed, but Jennifer's photograph proved at least some financial evidence had survived. The hidden folder in the county archives proved Daniel had made copies. The cassette proved he had confronted the men, but the original documents were gone. Then investigators searched a storage unit that had once belonged to Charles Rayner. The unit had been sealed for years. Inside were construction tools, old invoices, boxes of photographs, and a steel filing cabinet. The cabinet was locked. A locksmith opened it. Inside was a single envelope. No name, no address, just a date. October 18th, Sill, 1987. Inside were photocopies. Project 417. Bank transfers, payments, names, signatures, and one document that investigators had never seen, a payment authorization. $600. The recipient was Daniel Mercer, but Daniel had never received it. The authorization had been signed by James Hay. The money had been routed through a company controlled by Charles, then redirected to an account controlled by Martin Voss, and from Voss's account, it had gone to Charles. The same $600 had traveled in a circle. Investigators realized Daniel's withdrawal had been something else entirely. He had not stolen $600. He had been tracking $600. He had withdrawn money from his own account because he believed someone was watching his finances. The number in Charles's notebook had not been Daniel's money. It was the amount of the transaction Daniel was investigating. That made the motive even clearer. Daniel had discovered the financial trail. He had followed it. He had confronted the people responsible, and they had tried to stop him. But the envelope contained something more, a handwritten note. Not from Daniel, not from Charles, not from Hale. It appeared to have been written by Martin Voss. The note said, "Mercer has proof. If he talks, we're finished." Below it was a date, October 16th. the day before Daniel disappeared. The case had finally established motive, but investigators still needed the chain connecting that motive to the murder. Then the DNA laboratory contacted Mercer again. A second DNA sample had been recovered from the old jacket. This one was not Kane. It belonged to another male. The profile was compared against the Rayner family. It matched Eric Rayner. The probability was overwhelming. Eric's DNA was on Daniel's clothing, not on the exterior, inside the damaged fabric, in an area consistent with direct physical contact. The investigators now had biological evidence connecting Eric to Daniel during the confrontation, but Eric had already admitted being at the warehouse. His attorney could argue that the DNA came from a struggle. That did not prove murder. So the laboratory examined the DNA pattern again. There was a mixture: Daniel, Eric, and a third male. That third profile was the same one previously connected to the Voss family. Martin Voss. 3 men. 1 victim. 1 location. 1 night. And now biological evidence placing all 3 within the physical struggle. The defense could no longer dismiss the case as a financial dispute. The evidence suggested a confrontation, a violent confrontation, and the prosecutor began preparing arrest warrants. But one final question remained. Why had Kane's DNA appeared on Daniel's clothing before the official evidence collection? Because Kane had been there. Not after. Before. The sheriff had reached Daniel while he was still alive. Peter had said Kane knew. Miller had said Kane touched the jacket. Jennifer had seen Kane arrive. The radio recording placed Kane at the warehouse. The mileage placed his vehicle on the road. The financial records showed payments from Rayner. The private notes showed knowledge. The DNA placed Kane directly on Daniel's clothing. Piece by piece, the case was becoming impossible to ignore. Then investigators found the most disturbing document of all. It was hidden inside the original sheriff's case file, a report dated October 18, SIL, 1987. It had never been entered into evidence. The report contained only 1 paragraph. Subject located deceased. No location. No time. No signature. But the phrase located deceased was written before Daniel had officially been declared missing. The timestamp on the document was to 048. Daniel's family would not report him missing until the next morning. That meant someone had written that Daniel was dead hours before anyone officially knew he was missing. Investigators checked the typewriter ribbon. The report had been produced inside the sheriff's office. The person who typed it had access to the case, and only one person had authorized reports at that hour: Sheriff Harold Kane. The document was the closest thing the case had to a confession from the past. Kane knew Daniel was dead. He knew before the search began. He knew before the family called. He knew before the town woke up. And he had spent the next 39 years allowing everyone to believe Daniel had simply disappeared. The arrest warrants were prepared. Charles Rayner was charged. Eric Rayner was charged. Martin Voss was charged. But Harold Kane was dead. The sheriff, who had controlled the investigation, could never stand in court. His name would remain attached to the case forever. But investigators still had to determine whether Charles, Eric, and Voss could be prosecuted. The evidence was strong, but time had destroyed witnesses. Records were missing. Memories had faded. Some suspects were dead. Some evidence could not be tested. The prosecution knew the case would be difficult. Then, just days before the first arrest, Peter Rayner called Mercer. He said there was something else, something he had forgotten. He said that after Daniel was buried, Charles told him to destroy the tarp. Peter had burned it. But before the fire consumed it, Peter had noticed something inside the fold, a small silver object, a watch. Daniel's watch, the watch that had been found missing from his house, the watch that Daniel had always worn. Peter said Charles had taken it. Why? Nobody knew. But the watch was never recovered. Until Peter remembered one detail. Charles had kept it in a locked desk. That desk had been sold in 1994. The buyer had moved it to another property, and according to old property records, that property still existed. Investigators obtained a warrant. They opened the desk. Inside was a drawer that had been nailed shut. They removed the nails. There was a small cloth pouch. Inside was a broken watch. The back was scratched. The hands had stopped. 10:58. The same time printed on the gas station receipt. The same time referenced in the notebook. The same time that had appeared throughout the investigation. For 39 years, 10:58 had been nothing more than a number. Now it appeared to be the moment Daniel's life changed forever. The watch itself contained something else, a tiny trace of biological material. The laboratory tested it. Daniel's DNA was present. So was another profile. Charles Rayner. The watch had been handled by both men, and suddenly the final question was no longer whether Charles knew Daniel. He did. Whether Eric knew Daniel. He did. Whether Voss knew Daniel. He did. Whether Kane knew Daniel. He did. The question was whether these men had acted together, and whether the small town that had spent decades whispering about Daniel's disappearance was finally about to hear the truth, because the arrests were coming. And when the first police vehicle stopped outside Charles Rayner's house, the man who had spent nearly 4 decades believing the past was buried, looked through his window and saw the flashing lights. For the first time since 1987, someone was coming to his door. This time, they were not asking where Daniel Mercer had gone. They already knew. They were there to ask Charles Rayner why he had helped make sure nobody would ever find him. The first police vehicle stopped outside Charles Rayner's house just after dawn. There was no warning, no telephone call, no chance to prepare an explanation. 2 more vehicles followed. The street was quiet. Neighbors opened curtains. A dog began barking somewhere behind a wooden fence. Charles stood at the window and watched the officers approach. For 39 years he had lived with the belief that time had done what he needed it to do. The witnesses had aged. The records had disappeared. The sheriff was dead. The warehouse was gone. The people who knew the truth had either forgotten it or carried it to their grave. But time had not erased everything. It had only buried it. And now investigators had started digging. Charles opened the door before they could knock. He looked at Mercer, then at the warrant, then back at Mercer. "You found him," Charles said. It was not a question. Mercer replied, "Yes." Charles looked down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he whispered, "I knew you would." The officers entered. Charles was arrested without resistance. His hands were placed behind his back. The man who had once controlled construction contracts, county officials, and frightened witnesses was now standing in his hallway wearing an old gray sweater. No dramatic struggle, no shouting, just silence. As he was led outside, a neighbor asked what was happening. Nobody answered, but the news spread quickly. By noon, the entire town knew. The cold case had exploded back into the headline. 1987 disappearance reopened. Surprise arrest stuns small Texas town. Buried evidence links suspect to missing mechanic. DNA breakthrough after 39 years. The story that had once been a local mystery became national news. But Charles Rayner was only the beginning. Eric Rayner was arrested that afternoon. He was found at a motel approximately 40 miles from his home. He had apparently been preparing to leave. Investigators found 2 bags packed. Inside one was an envelope containing cash. Inside another were old family photographs. One photograph showed Charles, Eric, and Sheriff Kane near the warehouse. The date was October 17th, Sill, 1987. Nobody knew why Eric had kept it. But the photograph confirmed what investigators already suspected. All 3 men had been together that night. Martin Voss was arrested the following morning. He did not resist. When officers approached his house, he was sitting outside drinking coffee. He looked at them. Then he said, "I suppose the past finally caught up." That sentence appeared in newspapers within hours, but the arrests did not answer the biggest question. What exactly had happened inside the warehouse? Prosecutors knew the defense would attack the case. Charles was elderly. Eric was elderly. Voss was elderly. The crime was almost 4 decades old. Some witnesses were dead. Some records had disappeared. The sheriff could not testify. The original investigators were gone, and the central piece of evidence, the body, could not speak. The prosecution had to build the case around what remained: the tape. The DNA, the financial documents, the buried key, the photographs, the witnesses, Peter Rayner's confession, Jennifer Hale's testimony, and the records showing that officials had deliberately concealed information. The defense lawyers immediately attacked Peter. They called him unreliable. They said he was protecting himself. They said he had changed his story because he wanted a reduced sentence. They pointed out that Peter had admitted helping move Daniel. They argued that his testimony could not be trusted. Peter expected that. He had lived with the possibility for decades, but there was something the defense could not explain. The Cosette. The voices were real. Daniel was alive. Charles was there. Peter was there. Kane was there. The conversation had been recorded before investigators knew the tape existed, and the forensic analysis showed that the recording had not been digitally altered. Every breath, every movement, every interruption, preserved. 39 years in silence. Then the prosecution played it in court. Daniel's voice filled the room. "Give me the papers." Charles answered. "You don't understand what you're doing." Daniel replied, "I understand exactly what you're doing." A chair moved. Someone shouted. Then the impact. The courtroom went silent. Daniel's sister, Rebecca, sat in the front row. She was 70 years old. She had spent most of her adult life wondering whether her brother had suffered. Now she could hear his voice. Alive. Angry. Frightened. Fighting. The recording continued. Daniel said, "Rebecca doesn't know anything." Charles responded, "She doesn't need to." Then a third voice. Kane. "Enough." The impact came again. Rebecca covered her mouth. The recording ended. Nobody moved. The judge called for a recess. Outside the courtroom, reporters surrounded the courthouse. They wanted a statement from the family. Rebecca refused to speak. She walked past them. Her face was wet with tears. For her, the case had stopped being a headline. It was her brother's voice. A voice that had been trapped on an old Cosette for nearly 4 decades. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for the missing documents. They believed Daniel had created more copies. Perhaps he had hidden them before the confrontation. Perhaps someone else had found them. The evidence suggested that at least one copy had survived. But where? Then a retired librarian contacted investigators. She remembered Daniel. In 1987, she had worked at the local public library. She said Daniel had visited several times during the weeks before his disappearance. He had used the photocopier. He had requested old county planning documents. He had spent hours looking through public records. The librarian remembered something unusual. Daniel had rented a small private locker at the library. The lockers were used by students and local researchers. He had placed a brown envelope inside. He had never returned for it. The lockers had been removed in the 1990s. The contents were supposedly discarded, but the librarian had kept one envelope. She had found it years later inside a box. She had never opened it. She brought it to investigators. The envelope contained 27 pages. Project 417, bank transfers, company registrations, photographs, and a handwritten statement from Daniel. The statement was dated October 17th, Sill, 1987, hours before he disappeared. It began, "If this is found, I was right." The next sentence was even more disturbing. "They are not stealing the money for themselves." Investigators read the pages. Daniel believed the construction fraud was being used to finance something else, something larger. Money was being moved through multiple companies. But the final destination was not Texas. It was outside the country. Daniel had traced payments to an offshore account. He had found transfers moving through several banks. The amounts were substantial. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Project 417 was not a simple county corruption scheme. It was one part of a much larger financial network. Daniel had discovered it by accident. A vehicle repair invoice had led him to a contract. The contractor had led him to a payment. The payment had led him to another company. And eventually, he had reached the offshore account. Daniel believed the people involved were terrified. He would expose it. He wrote, "They know I copied the records. Then, if they come after me, the copies are somewhere safe." That sentence explained why investigators had never found everything. Daniel had hidden evidence. But where? The final page contained a clue, only 3 words. Where we started. Investigators assumed it meant the repair shop, but Daniel's sister believed otherwise. She remembered something he had told her years earlier. When he was a child, Daniel had spent summers fishing with his father near an old railway bridge. That was where Daniel had learned to swim, where he had met his closest friend, where his father had taught him to repair engines, where the family had spent weekends before his father died, where they had started. Investigators searched the area. The bridge was still there. The river had changed. The old fishing platform was gone. The surrounding land had been developed. But beneath the bridge was an abandoned concrete maintenance structure. Inside was a rusted metal box. The box had been sealed with an old padlock. The lock was broken. Inside were documents wrapped in plastic. The pages were damaged. But the names remained readable. Charles Rayner, James Hale, Martin Voss, Harold Kane, and several others. There were bank records, photographs, vehicle registrations, and one document that made investigators stop, a list of payments. Beside each name was an amount. Kane, $12,000. Rayner, $41,000. Voss, $18,500. Hale, $27,000. The final line contained no name, only the word, Mercer, eliminate. There was no date, but the handwriting appeared consistent with one of the men already under arrest. The document was sent to the laboratory. The result was consistent with Charles Rayner. The defense argued that the paper could have been written at any time, but the phrase was unmistakable. Daniel was not simply an obstacle. He had become a target. Investigators now believed the plan had been discussed before October 17th. Daniel had been watched. His movements had been tracked. His calls had been monitored. The meeting at the warehouse had been arranged. The confrontation had been planned. The violence may have been spontaneous, but the cover-up was not. It had been organized. That explained the destruction of records, the false reports, the missing evidence, the truck, the buried key, the concrete, the silence, and the payments. But one detail remained unresolved. Who actually struck Daniel? Peter claimed Charles did it. Charles claimed Peter had attacked him. Eric claimed he had never touched Daniel. Voss claimed he had not been at the warehouse. Each man blamed another. The prosecution needed to separate truth from survival. Then the medical examiner found something. A small metallic fragment embedded near one of Daniel's ribs. It had been overlooked during the original examination. The fragment was removed. It was analyzed. It contained traces of the same industrial alloy used in a construction tool. Investigators searched the Rayner Company inventory. One tool was missing, a heavy steel pipe used for concrete work. The tool had been listed in October 1987, then disappeared. No disposal record, no sale, no replacement. The fragment was consistent with the pipe, but the pipe itself was gone. Another missing object, another piece of the night that could never be fully recovered. Still, the case was stronger than it had ever been. The prosecutor prepared a timeline stretching across nearly 4 decades. Daniel discovers the fraud. He copies the records. He confronts the men. He disappeared. The sheriff controls the investigation. The case is quietly closed. Kane died. The buried toolbox is discovered. Then the DNA breakthrough. Then the arrest. For the first time, the entire story could be seen in one line. A young mechanic discovers something powerful people want hidden. He tries to expose it. He is lured into a confrontation. He is attacked. His body is moved. Evidence disappears. Officials bury the truth. And the town spends decades believing the wrong story. But there was still one name investigators had not fully explained. Jennifer Hale. She had recorded the confrontation. She had kept the evidence. She had watched Daniel walk into danger. And she had remained silent. The defense suggested she was protecting herself. The prosecution believed she was telling the truth, but Mercer wanted to know whether she had known about the murder before it happened. Jennifer finally answered. She said Daniel had warned her. He told her that if he disappeared, she should not trust anyone connected to the county, not even the sheriff. She had asked him why. Daniel had said, "Because the person who is supposed to protect me is already part of it." Jennifer had assumed he meant her father. Now she understood. He meant Cain. That revelation left only one question. Did Daniel know he was walking into a trap? The evidence suggested he did. He went anyway, because he believed he could expose them, because he believed the documents would protect him, because he believed the truth would matter, and because he did not know how far the people around him were willing to go. 39 years later, the town finally knew. The man they had searched for had never left Texas. The missing truck had never been a mystery. The warehouse had never been random. The $600 had never been meaningless. The sheriff had never been merely an investigator. And the people who had spent decades saying there was not enough evidence were now facing the evidence itself. But as the trial approached, another discovery was waiting. The final forensic report on the DNA had arrived, and it contained a detail nobody expected. The biological evidence on Daniel's clothing was not simply connected to Cain, Eric, and Val. There was another partial profile, a fourth male, someone outside the group investigators had already identified, someone who had never been arrested, someone whose name appeared only once in the original case file. And when Mercer saw that name, he realized the 1987 investigation had not merely missed a suspect. It had deliberately removed him from the story.